making a career in academia around the world right now is uncertain for many people.
Yes.
But it has been for a long time in the United States, at least, difficult to have an academic career, at least in philosophy, if you were questioning things like individualism and particularly individual moral responsibility.
Yes.
There's a lot of fear. I think a lot of fear. You if you get past just the intellectual arguments, I think you tap into the fear of what will happen if we can't hold people responsible. What will happen if we let people believe that they're not in control of their lives?
I think that's very similar, this argument, to, again, arguments that were made in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. Yeah, we kind of understand that there is no God. But even for Kant, right, it is like a necessary hypothesis, because if we don't work with this hypothesis, then everything will go to hell. But
terrible things will happen.
Yeah, but I think that fear is completely unwarranted. I think it's rather the other way around. I think we will open up much more positive possibilities if we replace that dogma of the sovereign individual with something like dependent belonging. All right. So this is the fourth time that we post a conversation with an author about their newly published book. Elena Esposito talked about artificial communication. Robert Sapolsky talked about determined. Brooke Ziporyn talked about experiments in mystical atheism. And today, Ladelle McWhorter, Emerita Professor for Philosophy at the University of Richmond and Stephanie Bennett Smith Chair of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, will talk about Unbecoming Persons, the Rise and Demise of the Modern Self, published by University of Chicago Press. There's a common thread that connects these four books. They all subvert, in one way or another, the dominant master narrative of the age of authenticity that has been shaping our politics, our economy, our common values, and our sense of self, the master narrative of the sovereign individual. Since the Enlightenment, we prefer to describe ourselves and others as sovereign individuals. It's our faith. It's what our civil religion believes in. And many videos on this channel have tried to show how this master narrative is shared by the left and the right in the present culture wars, represented, for instance, by Slavoj Žižek and Jordan Peterson. And one of the purposes of this channel is to deflate those culture wars by challenging its master narrative, politically, scientifically, and philosophically, and to present alternatives to it. The starting point for Unbecoming Persons is this observation, I quote, "For most of human history, people were not persons in the contemporary sense, and many were not persons at all. Yet they sometimes got along with each other and in the world reasonably well." Based on this observation, the first part of Unbecoming Persons is a genealogy, critically tracing how, surprisingly recently, we became persons. The second part, then, outlines how and why we can unbecome persons again. And we'll talk about both of these themes. Hello, Ladelle. Thank you very much for joining our channel and for your willingness to talk about your book, your upcoming new book. The title of that book, Unbecoming Persons, is ambiguous. I guess this was intentional, right?
Yes, of course it was. The book is really about ways in which we might undo or free ourselves from the notion of personhood as a way of defining who or what we are and who or what others are. But it also is ambiguous, as you say, because the word unbecoming is occasionally used to mean simply not very attractive or even ugly. And it is true, I think, in the research that I did on the history, the ancestry of the word person, the concept of person, particularly in its modern manifestation as a moral term, a moral status, that there's a lot of ugliness. There's a lot of violence and pain, oppression, and that's not, of course, the total story, but it's there. And I think as we uncover it, that's understanding, remembering, putting together the pieces of that aspect, those dimensions of the history of personhood, helps, in a way, helps us free ourselves from the concept insofar as we can at this point.
Right. So you look into the dark side of the concept of personhood.
To some extent, things have dark sides, and so you find them in the course of study.
Yeah, or maybe even some sort of dialectics of the terminology, and we'll get to that in a minute. You already said that the book actually takes a historical approach. To me, it read like some kind of actually genealogy, a little bit like in the tradition of Nietzsche and Foucault. And then I like this part. You trace how the term person is actually kind of new when it first came up in the 16th and 17th century. And that people used another word, a word that I didn't know exists in English, white. But I knew the German, I think earlier form of it, Wicht or Wichte. Can you explain a little bit about first the term Wicht and then how it came to this, or white, and how it then came to this shift from white to person?
Yes, sure. But first, let me say, yes, you're right to see this as a genealogical approach, not precisely a historical approach. My training as a philosopher is in the work of Michel Foucault, of course. His work draws heavily from Nietzsche and that tradition, and I think he venerates it in many ways through his approaches. So, yes, it's a genealogical study. I am not a linguist, so I have to be very careful on these points, but I found this part of my research absolutely fascinating. The reason that I knew that there was in English a word which in the 14th century in Chaucerian literature was pronounced probably wicht. Eventually it becomes white, as you say, and later in English, as the sound shifts occur in the course of the succeeding centuries. The word was commonplace in 14th century English and before, and the word person was not. Person, of course, is a Latin term, comes from persona, from the Latin. It came probably into English through Norman French. So it probably came in as a French word, more or less. And it to a great extent displaced the old Anglo-Saxon Germanic word wicht. The word wicht had several meanings. Its constellation of connections in Middle English were not only just human being, but vitality, strength. So a living human being, and it could sometimes apply in other ways to living things. So it wasn't so clearly distinct from other sorts of animals, although it was usually used to refer to human beings. But it could also emphasize, because it connoted strength, vitality, being alive and able to assert oneself, I suppose you could say.
I think our German listeners will, if I may, sorry for interrupting you. I think our German listeners will understand that, because as I said, like the word is not a common word anymore, Wicht, but people still understand it in German. And it's closely related to the word Gewicht, which in English is weight. And they must have the same origin, right? It's not anthropocentric, right? Everything has a weight. All kinds of living beings can be in one way or another Wichter, and they do have a weight. Yeah. So sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to point out
that's
this background.
Wonderful. I appreciate that. That's a wonderful addition to what I was saying. Then we get in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, the word in English as Middle English becomes modern English, the word begins to take on a different kind of connotation. It gradually ceases to be used generally to name human beings and comes to name, when it's used at all, it starts to disappear. But when it's used at all, it refers to weak people, children, the ill, oftentimes feminine people, the lesser, the subordinate in relationships. It persists though for 200 or 300 years, but in that usage, my hypothesis, and I don't know this, but I think it's likely. My hypothesis is that as the Norman French-speaking invaders, conquerors, began to be culturally important and also to intermarry, and the languages became mixed, that the status of some Norman French words was higher than the old Middle English and Anglo-Saxon. So people began to see people who use those words as lesser, or the words themselves as meaning something less. We have those words in English, lots of words, food words especially. The difference between sheep and mutton, for example, you would eat mutton, but you would herd sheep.
Right.
So it's the beef and cow, for example. So things that were part of a luxurious lifestyle, the food, have the elevated status, and they use the French word, or the Norman French, and or something derived from it at least.
Yes.
And the older words, the more Germanic Anglo-Saxon words, were reserved for manual labor, daily concerns of working people.
Yes.
So that's true in lots of areas of the English language still, even in modern English.
Yeah,
And I think that's the heritage of the loss of Wicht as well.
Yes, I think that sounds very plausible to me. So what you're basically saying is that the earlier version, when there was not yet talk about persons, Wicht or white meant basically a creature, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then later it became like a creature that actually doesn't have a lot of weight, a creature that is somehow less prestigious than a person. Once
Right.
person took over, the word weight, white, and like the word Wicht, which is still used in German in that second kind of derogatory sense. The word white or Wicht was demoted.
Yes. And the word person comes into German too, but I don't know the history of that.
Yeah, probably very closely connected history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit then about this meaning of the word person in comparison to weight or Wicht.
Again, as I say, I'm not a linguist, and I don't know for sure how all of these transformations may have occurred. I think probably that was a matter of political, economic status, and so on. But of course, the word person, persona, from Latin, has a long history, and it has a history as a status. It's a legal term, primarily, not exclusively, though. It meant someone who could be an owner, in particular, someone who could own other people as slaves, could own property. Also, though, and importantly and very closely allied to that, could appear in court, could bring suit, and could be sued. So somebody who had standing before the law, which of course is necessary if you are going to be a legal proprietor as well. That's the dominant history of the term. And I think it probably, it becomes, that is, the word person becomes very important when there is this revival of Roman law in Southern Europe particularly, and then in the British Isles in the 12th century and following. So it wasn't just because of the Norman invasion in 1066, but because of, I think, the importance that Roman law came to have in the development of legal systems in what became the United Kingdom and on the continent. So person comes into the language as a status, primarily as an elevated status, as one bringing with it a lot of rights and abilities and importance and wealth. Although not all persons were wealthy, all persons had the ability to acquire wealth.
Yeah. So as you said, it's closely connected to the notion of a proprietor. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yes, that is definitely the
Yeah.
dominant history
Right.
of the term.
Yeah. And again, like in German, this is connected with the notion of being an Eigner. In German, like in English, we have this connection, which I think is very important for our purposes here, both genealogically and philosophically. How the notion of a personhood comes from the notion of proprietor, which means to own property. And the
Yes.
German word Eigner, and then also means originally to own something, to be a proprietor. And then it becomes later especially then in the 19th and 20th century, it becomes connected with Eigenheit, with uniqueness, with Eigentlichkeit, with authenticity, and so forth. But I think it's very important to see the origin, the genealogy, how this comes is first of all, how this is very, very recent, surprisingly recent. And this kind of very anthropocentric notion of the individual, and how it is replacing this wider notion that doesn't yet have the connotation of being a proprietor, namely, but has the connotation of simply being a creature or having some sort of physical weight. A philosophical turning point that you write about in your book is then introduced basically by John Locke. So initially, the person was this socioeconomic proprietor, and that was associated, as you also just pointed out, with accountability. Also, the word account, right, which is connected with property, and so you become legally accountable. But then with John Locke, as you describe in the book, the concept was extended and became some sort of a key term for what could be probably called something like a moral individualism. So the notion of accountability also becomes something like moral responsibility that is now emphasized.
As I lay it out in the book, the turning point really is with John Locke, and it's with the second edition of the Essay Concerning Human Understanding in the 1690s. And I hesitate always to attribute something so momentous to one person and to one text. But in this case, I have not seen evidence that it was a general movement. Obviously there were things in Locke's context, culture, political milieu that were influential, that mattered a great deal, that helped this along, that without which it would not have been possible for him to do what he did. But I really do think a lot of it hangs on what he did in that text. And what he did was, as all Englishmen of his day and age who were very well-educated people, he was very steeped in Latin and in law. He would have been familiar, even though he was not a lawyer, he would have been very familiar with legal theory and literature, and of course with Latin. So he knew what he was doing when he chose the term person for what he was describing. He wanted to give some account, so to speak, of what it was to be a moral person, to be a moral being. And he does that by, as I argue in the book, by marrying two traditions of the term person. The first is the forensic one, as he puts it, the forensic one that is inherited from Roman law and canon law by that point. The other is directly inherited from Christian theology, which is the history of the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. For your listeners who would have no idea what that was, I'll just briefly explain. So for Christians, there's been a great deal of strife and difficulty for hundreds of years over the fact that that's a strongly monotheistic religion, so there is one God, But at the same time, there's strong belief that there are these manifestations of deity that appear to be distinct. There is the creator who is eternal from before the beginning, often referred to as the Father. There is Jesus, the man who was born at a certain point in human history and walked the earth, but is also believed to be a deity, often called the Son. And then there is this invisible presence that is available for prayer and intercession, often called the Holy Spirit or sometimes the Paraclete. These three manifestations appear to be distinct deities, but as a monotheistic religion, Christianity cannot tolerate distinct deities.
Sure.
So for almost the entirety of Christian history, there has been this worry over how to explain the oneness of God and the threeness of God. So this doctrine of the Holy Trinity was devised and refined and changed and argued over for centuries in an effort to explain that. That debate heated up again in the second half of the 17th century in England after the English Civil Wars, because one of the things that happened during the English Civil Wars was that people not only overthrew their king, they overthrew their bishop, their archbishop, and they attacked the church hierarchy. The church was, of course, a governmental institution in Foucault's sense in England in those days, as it was most of Europe. And people paid tithes to churches just as they paid taxes to states. So they were not very happy. They were not very happy with the hierarchy, with the doctrine, with what they saw as corruption, and so on and so forth. Many different reasons why people were unhappy. The church was unsettled. The hierarchy was in disarray, just as the state was in the aftermath of the Civil War. And so to put it back together, to stabilize things, it was necessary to straighten out some of these doctrinal disputes. And so the doctrine of the Trinity was at issue, a very hotly debated and dangerous topic in many respects during Locke's time. One of his friends developed a theory of how to explain the distinctness of the three deities or manifestations of deity, how to explain that while still accounting for the oneness of the Godhead. And he did that by talking about ownership of memory or thought or experience. There are different ways you could say that, but he said, this was William Sherlock. He said that the different entities or different manifestations of Godhead had distinct, we might say, mental contents. And they were aware of themselves as distinct units of mental content, even while being part of a whole that was one. I don't claim that this argument is correct or that it even makes a great deal of sense to me, but it was one of many arguments that tried to do that sort of thing, and it was very influential to Locke because this was his good friend. This was a member of his intellectual circle. Mm-hmm. And it was a familiar way of understanding personhood because person was the name that had been given to those different entities, three persons. So here was another set of meanings for personhood, a meaning for personhood that was not a status, not a legal status, mm-hmm. but was rather a kind of consciousness, a very modern notion, consciousness. So Locke took these two traditions, tradition of person as a kind of unified consciousness on the one hand, and the tradition of person as a forensic status on the other. Mm-hmm. He put them together, and he made all of us persons. Everyone's a person.
So that was a decisive shift, and you explained that very nicely. Now, along with this shift from accountability in a legal sense to accountability in like the modern personal, including then the moral sense, that that leads to the possibility of making a person responsible, again, not just in the legal sense, but also in a sense of blaming them, of ascribing guilt to them. And I guess Nietzsche
Yes.
talks about that a lot. Is that correct? Do we see here a connection between, let's say, what Nietzsche does in the genealogy of morality, like not a very tight connection, but a certain parallel between your project as well, that you describe how the ascription of guilt has to do something with a specific concept of personhood.
Yes, I'm sure Locke would have been horrified at Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche probably would have been happy enough for Locke to be horrified.
Yeah.
But so for Nietzsche, I think Nietzsche's, as I read Nietzsche on that point, I believe that he is trying to explain in some way, or at least give a plausible story about how it was that interiority, mental interiority, gets established and recognized for human beings. Whereas I think for Locke, he's actually trying to impose it. And so there's a difference in that respect. But certainly Nietzsche, coming after Locke, is working with the tradition in which this kind of interiority, consciousness, and the accountability that, as you point out, goes with that. That's already been established, and in fact, it's deep rooted by the time Nietzsche's writing, and he's not happy with it.
Right.
At least in some ways, although Nietzsche also, of course, says this is what makes us interesting creatures, you
Sure.
know. For Locke, I think it's an imposition, and I think he means it to be. I think he is forcing accountability on people in what was still largely a class society. Not that people weren't accountable, but they were accountable in limited ways to certain people in certain relationships. Locke is making this a generalization. Everybody, and he's doing it through ownership. And I think maybe I left that key point out just a minute ago. The individual consciousness is said to own its contents, its ideas, and however those ideas work out, whether they're based on perceptions or whether they're memories or whatever. The person owns those mental contents, and the person owns the actions that are the results of the mental processes that consciousness engages in. All of those things are the ways in which the forensic term and the consciousness, or we could say the theological or quasi-theological term, gets used. That the priorship, the ownership,
Yeah.
is what binds those two things together and
Exactly.
makes the person that is now the modern moral person, the
Yeah.
post-Lockean person, accountable.
Exactly.
Whether they want to be or not, whether they feel accountable or not, they can be held accountable.
Exactly. Culpable as well. They can be made culpable.
Right, yes.
And that becomes very obvious, and you write about this in your book, in connection actually with slavery, these two sides of personhood. On the one hand,
Yes.
the emphasis on, let's say, some form of individual agency and being, owning oneself, ownership of oneself. But on the other hand, also this idea of complete culpability of the individual. And that is maybe we can call it a certain dialectics that then, again, becomes very concrete with regard to both slavery and colonialism. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes. In the Americans, at least, tend to look back at slavery and the horrors of it through the lens of 19th century defenses of slavery. And many of those defenses in the 19th century, when the institution was under tremendous attack just before the Civil War here, the defenses often hinged on claims that people of African descent and people of other sorts of descents were not part of the same species as people of European descent. So white people were human beings, and people of other races, as they were termed by that time, were not human beings. There was some other kind of species. That, of course, was debunked at the end of the 19th century with Darwin and other people's work. But when we look back now from a 20th or 21st century perspective, there's a tendency to say that's what justified slavery all along, that the people were dehumanized, the people were depersonalized, that they were seen as less than persons or less than human beings. In fact, for most of the history of the institution of slavery in North America, people were considered persons. Slaves
Yes.
were persons.
Yeah, that's very important.
And it
Yeah.
didn't get them freedom, and it
Yes.
didn't get them respect. And that's one of the reasons I think we need to be very careful with the use of this term person in the present day when we want to claim rights and respect dignity for people and for other entities. There's people claiming for chimpanzees and so on and so forth. Person was, moral person simply meant you were accountable, you owned what you did. Your actions were yours. If you were a slave, then you were to do as you were told. And if you failed to do as you were told, it was your fault.
Yes.
So you could be punished for that.
Yeah. Really, the important point is here that people who were made slaves their being slaves could be justified also on the basis of them being persons rather than on the basis of them being not persons.
Right. And this is particularly important in relation to the dispossession of indigenous peoples throughout the Americas and elsewhere.
Yeah.
What was assumed was you're a person, you have certain moral responsibilities. If you don't meet those moral responsibilities, then other persons are justified in punishing you or limiting you, restricting you from certain things, and in dispossessing you. If you are, as Locke thought, wasting your territory, your land, your resources, you're being irresponsible.
Right.
So you don't deserve to have those things, and others need them. So they
that's basically the white man's burden argument, correct?
Yes, I suppose it is.
Yeah. Right, that slavery and disenfranchising of native population is kind of being based on them being persons, but persons.
Right. They are persons who are not doing their jobs.
Right.
Being
so they must
bad persons.
We must hold them accountable for that.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the argument, and philosophically, that is then expanded, let's say, or deepened in the 18th and 19th century with Kant and Mill. And we get this concept of personhood, let's say the complete person, complete concept of personhood as the autonomous individual, kind of this process from white, Wicht, to accountable person in a legal sense, then to accountable person in a moral sense, eventually becomes this Enlightenment concept of the sovereign individual, so to speak, the full concept of personhood. Is that correct?
Yes. I would say with Kant is closer to Locke than some of the discourses of sovereignty, the sovereign person in the 19th century. Kant, the word autonomy I associate with Kant, obviously, because Kant is saying, much as Locke did, that our process of reasoning should, if we engage in it, if we cultivate it and engage in it properly and honestly, our process of reasoning should lead us to conclusions that would bring about proper action, however you just want to describe that, moral action, productive action, sorts of things that Locke would be interested in. And Kant takes that to, I think, its logical conclusion in many respects and develops it in very sophisticated ways. In the 19th century, there's a kind of explosion of this sort of discourse that's not particularly philosophical, or at least not at the depth of either Locke or Kant. In the what I describe in the book is the work of Josiah Warren, and I use him because he's very interesting, but as sort of emblematic of discourses of sovereign individualism that began to crop up, particularly in the United States.
Right.
This is the era, of course, of the pioneers and the conquest of the West and expansion, and also the expansion of the understanding of citizenship, not yet to former slaves or indigenous peoples or women even, but to common men, to laborers, men who don't have estates, enormous tracts of land. Citizenship and dignity and respect and so on and so forth are being attributed to, at least in this country and I think elsewhere as well, to most white men, even if they're not of noble birth or anything like that. And so this fellow, Josiah Warren, who was a laborer, goes west. He's a very smart man, very young man at the time. He goes west. He tries to make a life for himself in Ohio, which then was the West here. And he wrote a tremendous amount, but mostly what he did was try to found societies on the basis of individualism. And so he writes all these books and pamphlets on how to do that. He's a very practical-minded fellow. He I think is reflecting something that's going on in the 19th century as this notion of self-determination,
right,
and self-sufficiency become very pervasive, yes, among at least white male Americans. He's an interesting character, and in some ways he's a very sympathetic character. But what he says is what you said, that the individual is sovereign. And he had the good grace, at least, to think that extended to women and enslaved people and even children of a certain age, that they should make their own way in life and they should have control over what they did, over the products of their work, and over the decisions that influence the course of their lives, that should not be done for them. Mm. He was quite egalitarian in that way. But he used this term sovereign, and that would have made no sense to John Locke. John Locke wouldn't have thought of sovereign in the terms of autonomy that we get after Kant. But so I think that what happens with people like Warren and the sorts of popular discourses that emerged in the 19th century, in the United States at least, I think what happens is that the notion of person actually splinters in some respects and gets a bit destabilized rather than solidified, as it might have in the tradition of autonomy that we see in Kant, because it's just not possible. It's not just that it's a kind of fantasy that people could be in complete control of their lives and their decisions and so on. It's not even possible to conceive of such a thing, given the meanings of the terms at the time, and have everything stay stable. So he tried very hard to talk about sovereignty as something that was characteristic of all persons, and persons were all human beings, in his view. So, but it can't work that way. No one can be in complete control. No one can be autonomous to that extent. No one can be independent. And that's really what he was trying to establish, was the notion of independence of each.
Yeah, so I think it's very clear that we see this development, from white Wicht to the person in the legal sense, then the person in the moral sense, and then eventually to this very strong emphasis on the autonomous and sovereign individual and in the 19th century, which again is surprisingly late because we take it so much for granted nowadays. But this historical development seems to be very obviously in parallel with the development of, on the one hand, capitalism, and on the other hand, with processes of secularization. So it seemed to me when I was reading this that this development replaces earlier religious ways of thinking, religious ways of legitimizing social and political and economic structures. So when we get to the 19th century, we basically have a replacement of our understanding of the state, of our understanding of morality, uh, um, that is no longer grounded in religious values and norms. But this notion of the sovereign individual kind of takes over and becomes the secular, let's say, metaphysical cornerstone of how we conceive of our legal and moral orders and of our economic orders. Can we say that?
I want to be cautious about that because, well, capitalism and secularization are very, very broad movements and terms. And it's hard to know exactly what causes what and how things are interconnected without looking at things in much more closely and locally, because things are different in different times and places too. But it certainly is true, I think, that the notion of the individual and the relative independence of the individual as a cognitive and as a moral unit is extremely important in the development of the economic system, the capitalistic system of the 19th century and into the 20th century, certainly. It is hard to imagine some aspects of the development of capitalism and also colonialism in tandem with capitalism. I think they go very closely together. Without this notion of individual as proprietor and as agent and as independent.
Right.
So secularization may be even more complicated. It is certainly true that Locke and others of his time and somewhat before and for a while after were very concerned with trying to reduce, if not eliminate, the theological underpinnings of notions of human life, various aspects of human life, morality in particular, because after the Reformation and with lots of the development of sects, SECTS, and the splintering of churches all over Europe, and particularly in England and Scotland, Ireland, it was not possible to bring people together and to have them agree on moral norms, customs, or laws on the basis of theological tenets anymore. There had to be some other way, some other points of consensus. And I think Locke was very consciously trying to produce that. So in that sense, there's a kind of secularization of morality that goes on with Locke and many other thinkers of that time period.
Right.
It's not totally secularized, though, because as I pointed out, he's borrowing so much from Christian theology and things associated with Christianity that it's built into the concepts that he generates, and that others did it as well. So there's a secularization.
We can probably say
in one sense, there's a kind of crypto Christianity that creeps into.
Yeah. Sorry for interrupting you. Yeah, I think this secularization process that we were just discussing is probably much more prominent in Europe than in the American context, right?
I think so.
Yeah. But nevertheless, I think it's quite obvious that this concept of sovereign individuality that was developed out of the concept of personhood becomes very foundational, not just in an existential manner for how we conceive of ourselves, for our sense of self nowadays, but also for legal and economic systems, right? That it provides the rationale that was previously provided by religious concepts. Right now, the legitimacy of political power and the legal legitimacy rests on the concept of sovereign individuality, rather than on some sort of the divine nature of personhood. Isn't that correct?
I think so. I'm not sure to what extent the individual has to be sovereign for that to be the case, but certainly there is an extreme emphasis on individualism.
Right.
And there are various versions of that, but they all seem to be extremely powerful in underwriting much of contemporary life.
Right. And the second part of your book then is about questioning this notion of individualism, this very strong, powerful notion of individualism that we tend to take for granted nowadays. Also, many academics, right? If you look at a lot of the discourses that are going on in philosophy, the notion of agency and of individual rights and so forth, and the empowerment of such individual agency is regarded as somehow the most fundamental principle in many at least discourses. And again, like in the second half of your book, you question precisely this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I was having completed the genealogical part of the book in the first 4 chapters. I had done part of the work of what Foucault calls getting free of ourselves, right? To do work to try to loosen the hold of certain kinds of very fundamental notions and ways of being and ways of understanding ourselves. That was what I wanted to do, to get free of personhood, or to see to what extent that would be possible. The genealogical work does that in a kind of negative sense, in that it shows you, helps you understand, puts you through, I guess, the process of the unraveling backwards of a concept that seems so fundamentally unchallengeable. But it doesn't do anything to help you build, or doesn't do much to help you build some other way of being. And so at the end of those 4 chapters, I was wondering, well, what do I do now if I want to continue this process? And it was primarily a strategic question. How can I continue this work of getting free of personhood? The first thing I decided to do, and I do it in the next 2 chapters, was to go more deeply into some of the pieces of personhood that I had identified in the genealogy. One was ownership, obviously, and one was individuality. So there's a chapter on each. And the attempt was to take those apart, not just genealogically, though. There's a little bit of genealogical work there, but primarily just in any way I could find to take those apart. So, yes, so I go into the notion of ownership in some depth, and then the notion of individuality in the penultimate chapter. And the final chapter is an attempt to kind of to be creative or constructive in other ways of understanding selfhood, others, and how we might live. But you want to ask specific questions about those things, I think.
Do you want to talk more about these 2 critiques of ownership and individualism, about these 2 chapters in your book? Maybe describe the main contents of these 2 chapters.
Okay. So the 5th chapter on ownership, as I said, it's a strategic undertaking. The idea was to see if I could further disturb my own assumptions about myself and others, about ourselves as owners. Not because intellectually I didn't see the problems with that and the history of that, but because it's still hard, even when you do see, to know how to live differently. This is something that I think takes practice and is a practical concern. And so I just went on a fishing expedition, as they say, looking for ways of understanding ownership, both ways that are dominant and ways that are perhaps not dominant. So first thing I did was take note of the fact that we use that term in English, at least, and it sounds to me like, from things that you were saying, this is also probably true in contemporary popular German. We use terms associated with ownership for lots of things that have nothing to do with tangible property. And I began to investigate that, and I actually found a great many of those discourses funny when you start really looking at them. I don't know, does this happen in your institutions where you say, we were told, our administration would often tell us to encourage our students to take ownership of their education.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this taking ownership is a very pertinent, I guess, expression. And we don't use that semantics very much here in Macau, in China. But of course, it's extremely prevalent in the United States and in the Anglo-American Western realm. In Germany, as you said, it's more this emphasis on Eigenheit, Eigentlichkeit, and Selbstbestimmung, self-determination. These are like very powerful concepts that are always emphasized. And for me, the interesting thing about this was that this is not, in Germany, this is not, how to say, this is not just the case in the legal and the political context, but especially also in German existentialism in Heidegger, right? The emphasis on Eigentlichkeit. So that's a different trajectory of, I guess, the very same semantics that comes out of personhood.
Yeah, I do think you're right that these are somewhat different strains, but closely related. So in the American context, we're always taking ownership of everything, which seems to mean be responsible, get ahead. It has to do with competitions, competitive success,
right?
And a little bit less with what we might call authenticity. I think there has been that too in the American context. Foucault used to jokingly refer to something like that, at least, as the California cult of the self. The idea that you had to do everything to be yourself and express yourself and be original and nonconformist. And I think that when I was growing up as a child, a teenager, a young adult, there was a lot more emphasis on that in the United States than there is now, in some respects at least. The taking ownership is a little bit less creative in a way than the idea of being original, originating things. But they are closely related, and they do, I think, come out of the same linguistic configuration.
Now, in your book, and this is one of the sentences I underlined and I like most, you point out that the hard truth, as you write, is that actually this whole vocabulary is a semantics that doesn't really have a strong empirical basis, right? In fact, we are not autonomous individuals. In fact, we're not very original, right? You say that although we try hard to act as persons, we are not. We are not in control. We don't even understand our own situations, the real conditions of our existence in this globalized world. We do not know who or what we are, how much less how we should or even could conduct ourselves. So I find this is a very important criticism, right? We kind of, in the West, let ourselves be convinced by this semantics that we are using. And I find this very strange. And also in my conversation with Robert Sapolsky about his book, Determined, right? He was reporting about his discussions with philosophers, mostly American analytic philosophers. And he also pointed out, this is again a basic thesis of his whole book, that there is no such thing as free will, right? And that somehow intelligent philosophers in North America, they understand that. But nevertheless, the power of the semantics of the sovereign individual or of personhood is so strong that they insist that we cannot let go of it. So on the one hand, we basically have the empirical evidence that we are not persons in that very strong 19th, 20th century sense of sovereign individuality. And yet we're not willing to accept this hard truth. Isn't that the case? And as you said yourself, we find it even difficult personally. Like, right? How can we live without this notion?
Personhood has grown to absorb a lot of the good things that people thought about themselves and others prior to its advent, I think. Yes, I think that line comes actually from the introduction to the book, doesn't it? After my story about how
it is
difficult.
Page 10 or something. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I think we understand very little of who and what we are. And I think we will never understand a lot of it because I'm thinking primarily here in biological terms. The things that have to happen for us to have this conversation are vast, so much, so quickly. All the things that have to happen in the cells of our bodies, in the physics of the electrical waves through our brains, all those things are so immensely complicated,
right,
and yet happen regularly. We will never understand them. Even if we understand them, we would never be conscious of them while they're happening. Right. That's not possible. Consciousness, conversation, language, whatever we take to be ourselves happens on top of all of that somehow. And of course, we don't control that. We are generated by it. And of course, many, many other things as well. So I think part of what I wanted to say in that notion of the hard truth is that personhood as the owner, the controller, the one in charge, the commander, the sovereign, that has to be false. Whatever else is true, I don't know, but that has to be false. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is causally determined in that old Kantian sense of causality. I didn't think that either, but because I don't think quantum physics allows for quite that, among other reasons.
Yeah.
But I do think it's just the notion both of the ownership and control, the independence that goes with personhood, and as you were pointing to, the notion of the individuation that comes with that. Those are just not true. They're insupportable.
Yeah. And yet they dominate very strongly our current society, politically, legally, but also existentially. Our sense of self is very strongly dominated on these conceptions, which we understand to be not correct. And that is a kind of an absurd situation. Maybe that is kind of the absurd condition of the 21st century that we find ourselves in. Now, you try to, or not you try, you do suggest, I think, a very powerful concept as an alternative to that, namely the concept of dependent belonging. And to conclude our conversation, I'd like you to talk a little bit as an alternative to the concept of autonomy and sovereignty and personhood in this very strong sense, this idea of dependent belonging.
It's a preliminary gesture, you might say. It's not a theory or even a piece of advice, but I do try to think about, given what I think we do know about how it is that we live and about our own histories and the cultural histories, conceptual histories that we've been discussing, it seems to me that one of the things that would make sense is to think of ourselves as belonging to the systems, the forces, the context, the histories that generate us, as I just said a minute ago, that we are generated by those things. The selves that we take ourselves to be are projections or products or something, somehow reflecting those processes and very powerful networks of forces. So the belonging that I'm talking about is the belonging to those networks, some quite non-human, some quite human,
yes,
and And so if we think of ourselves as belonging to rather than them belonging to us
Right.
as individual proprietors, we reverse that notion of ownership, I think.
Right.
Or maybe we just blow it away because
Yes.
it's not that the universe owns me, not at all,
No.
but that somehow I belong to
Right.
it. So that's the belonging part. The dependent part is, of course, obvious in all of that. There could not be such a self, such a conversation as we are having if there were not all that, if we did not belong to those configurations of forces. I also use the term active belonging in that chapter.
Right.
And that really gets to the perhaps alternative way of trying to live as we try to put together lives and self-conceptions and relationships and so on and get about our business. We need, I think, I am experimenting at least with the notion that the belonging that I can intellectually espouse is something I must actively produce in my behavior. I must enact it in a knowing or a self-aware way. Knowing that I belong, it must inform my action. So how would I act if I belonged to the world? How would I act if I belonged to my community? How would I act if I belonged in conversation with my conversational partner? How would I be? That's not a moral precept by any means, far from it, but at least it might be a general direction for how life might be able to go, how we might create some other ways of understanding ourselves and others, and how we might create other ways of being together on this planet in ways that don't destroy us.
Yeah, to me, that's actually a very systems theoretical notion. I know you don't really work with systems theory, but for me, it sounds very systems theoretical. I think it's clearly this notion of dependent belonging is clearly a notion of contingency in the double sense that or dependent, right? But contingency also in the sense of openness. And this is the other part you talk about, right? This active belonging. Contingency means the future is open. There are various options. We're not in control. We can never know what will actually happen. And yet we're not determined. And again, I think that's philosophically very important to go beyond not just the notion of ownership, but also what I would think is a false dichotomy of being determined or having free will. It's neither nor. Right. And like also for Sapolsky, his whole book is informed by this kind of premise that we're either determined or we have free will. But I think such notions, such as dependent belonging, they're really helpful because they help us to kind of break out of this kind of false fallacy of this the dichotomy between free will and being determined. So that's why I also find your book so important. So thanks for writing the book.
Well, thank you. And thank you for reading it.
I would just like to ask you, I don't know if we have to publish this and we can edit it out. I mentioned these two books in our conversation, the one by Henry Rosemont. Henry Rosemont passed away, I think now, nearly 10 years ago. We were good friends, and I still feel bad that I didn't really respond much to his book. And I wish he would have lived longer so I could have engaged more about this book. So I kind of do it a little bit as a posthumous a thank you to him that I try to promote the book a little bit, and I recommended it to you, the book Against Individualism. But when I read your book, it strongly reminded me of Henry's book, and I really do think that his project and your projects are highly compatible. I don't know if you had a chance to read it, but if so, I would just be interested in your view on that.
I wasn't able to get hold of a copy of it. I did look for it, and I think I know how I can get one now. So it will be something that I will look into. And I thank you for the recommendation. But no, I haven't read it yet.
I mean, it's not a very influential book, right? And unfortunately, Henry passed away like 10 years ago, and I'm not sure that this is it's not in the academic mainstream. But, I found, to me at least, that you were kind of kindred spirits. Is that the right way to say it?
It
Yeah.
would be nice to meet another.
And
Yes.
and I do think, like, I mean, this also the other people I interviewed on my channel, like Brooke Zipporah, and this is actually how this interview between us came about, right? Because Brooke Zipporah, he is also with the University of Chicago Press, and then your editor contacted me and sent me this list of books, and then I was immediately interested in your book. And so, which is what I will say also in the introduction to our conversation, that your book fits nicely in the other conversations with authors of new books that have been published on my channel. And they're all in one way or another, including Brooks. And of course, I didn't have one with Henry because he's dead. But all these books, in one way or another, represent this kind of academic minority that doesn't subscribe to the, let's say, dogma of the sovereign individual or of the autonomous person. And so I see the channel a little bit as a forum for this non-mainstream view, at least not in the West, that we kind of try to point out, as you call it, the hard truth, that this notion of personhood is not very realistic. And then obviously for Henry, just as for me and also for Brooke Zipporah, for us it is, I guess, much easier to to understand or to accept the hard truth, because we all come from Eastern philosophy. I mean, you work with Native American thought, which is also much more kind of lends itself to accepting the hard truth. So if you're not rooted philosophically primarily in modern Western thought, then it's much easier to accept this hard truth. Then much easier than it is, I guess, for the large majority of contemporary people in the Western liberal world who work in the humanities. Because at least my impression is that if you don't, if you accept the hard truth, it becomes actually very difficult for you to, if I may say so again, we don't have to post this, to make a career in current academia, because it's a kind of because it kind of just like, okay, I'm exaggerating. Like it's a little bit like if you were in the 17th, 18th, still 19th century, and you would say, well, the hard truth is there is no God. Now to say the hard truth is there is no sovereign individual, there is no autonomous person. That's a little bit like saying, difficult as it was for Kant, still for Kant to say there is no God.
Yes, I think it is very difficult. And of course, I think making a career in academia around the world right now is uncertain for many people.
Yes.
But it has been for a long time in the United States, at least, difficult to have an academic career, at least in philosophy, if you were questioning things like individualism and particularly individual moral responsibility.
Yes.
There's a lot of fear. I think a lot of fear. If you get past just the intellectual arguments, I think you tap into the fear of what will happen if we can't hold people responsible. What will happen if we let people believe that they're not in control of their lives? Something terrible will happen.
Yeah.
But it might if we don't have any other ways of thinking. But
I mean, I think that's very similar, this argument, to, again, arguments that were made in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. Yeah, we kind of understand that there is no God. But even for Kant, right, it is like a necessary hypothesis, because if we don't work with this hypothesis, then everything will go to hell. But
terrible things will happen.
Yeah, but I think that fear is completely unwarranted. I think it's rather the other way around. I think we will open up much more positive possibilities if we replace that dogma of the sovereign individual with something like dependent belonging.
Yes, it's pretty clear terrible things are happening.
Exactly.
Because
exactly.
Think of themselves
Just as it was the case with the notion of God. Also, a lot of terrible things happened not despite, but precisely because of the monotheistic dogma.
Yes.
Maybe we can include this. We can make that decision later on. I think the viewers of my channel would probably be interested in those aspects as well.